Okay? So what's the deal with route helper functions? One of the nice reasons that Rails separates out routes into their own file, instead of just having them inline the way we did in Sinatra, is that it allows you to separate the way you name things from the code that handles the things. Which means that basically it's a level of indirection for how you're mapping HTTP routes to actions in your code. In particular, here are 3 ways, all equivalent, that you could generate in one of your views a link that, when clicked, would show you the details for a particular movie. So for example, we're assuming in this example that within the body of the view, by the time the view is being rendered, it has access to a variable called movie. And one of the ways that we could say, OK, what is the RESTful route for showing details about a movie? Well, I've copied over the routes for reference. You can see that the 4th line down is the show action. And we just need to construct a URI that is /movies/ whatever the ID of the movie. OK? So here's one way to do it. We have a link. And the href is exactly this. Remember that the %= means evaluate this as Ruby code and substitute in the result. So this will come out to /movies/ whatever the ID of this movie happens to be. The user clicks on it, and a GET request with that URL gets generated back to your app. Success. Another way to do the same thing is, first of all, instead of actually putting the tag in, we could put in a tag called link to, which is a Ruby helper, one of many, that actually generates a URI for you. And we'll talk about multiple reasons to use these. But in general, the reasons that Ruby gives you indirect, or Rails gives you indirection for a lot of these things, is that in production environments, you could do things like linking to images that are actually stored on a different server to speed things up. It's very cool. But for the moment, you can take my word for it that link to is a plain old Ruby function that's part of the Rails library. The first argument is the text that's going to be what the user sees that's clickable. The second argument is the URI that's going to be generated as a result of that link. Okay, so this line of code calling link to will generate the exact same HTML as this first line where we did it kind of the hard way and by hand. But there's an even better way to do it. And it's the way that is preferred, and you'll see in all well-written Rails apps, which is the third one, which is instead of constructing the URI in place, we're calling this helper that got generated for us called movie path. Basically, for each one of these routes, there is a helper that if we add _path to the end of it, it'll generate the correct URL for that thing. In this case, movie path is going to generate any one of, let's see. Sorry, I got to stand back a little bit. But movie path will generate which ones match as. So it's going to be any one of these, movies ID. Movie path will take one argument, and it will end up generating the same thing. Why would you use this instead of actually just kind of putting the URI in place? Because in the future, if anything changes about the way that you've chosen to name your routes, or the way you've named the controller actions that correspond to them, automatically these helpers will now generate the right thing. If you didn't use it, you'd have to go through all of your code, find every place where you had manually tried to construct a route, and make sure every one of those places changed so that instead of movies, now we call them films or something, right? Now you've got to actually go through and change every single hand-generated URI, as opposed to changing just in the one place in routes.rb. So this is kind of an example of dry, don't repeat yourself, which says there should be only one place where a given type of information lives. In this case, the information is mapping between routes and actions. It only lives in one place, which is the routes file. And anywhere that you need to use that information, these helper methods are automatically provided for you so that you don't ever have to repeat this in multiple different files. You don't have to have multiple places where you are manually constructing a URI. There was a question.
So how does, even for like the first one, how does especially for the third one, how does it know? Because there's lots of ones that we name as movies, right?
Right. So for example, here it says movie path, and there's like 4 different things, right? So all of these 4 that say as movie, it could match any of those. So how does it know which one to generate? Excellent question. Well, one part of the answer is we're trying to pass in an argument in this case. If we just called movie path without any argument, it would imply that the only one that it matches, actually I think all the ones, all the ones that actually match movie singular have an ID parameter that's part of the route. Where's the post? Oops, that's also a typo. Sorry. Hold on. I hate when I make typos like that confuse people. My deepest apology. There. As I was saying, all the ones that have movie singular on the right-hand side also expect an ID to be part of the route. And Rails is smart enough to, even though this thing is not an ID, this is an actual movie object, Rails will extract its ID and put it into the route for you. Okay, so thank you for pointing that out because it made me catch the typo. Do people understand what the question was here? That basically I'm saying movie path, but if you look at all the routes that are labeled with as movie, there's like 4 different ones that could match. Previously there were 5, but that was a typo. There are 4 different ones that could match. But in fact, all of those generate the same thing, right? All of the ones that movie path with a single argument, they all end up generating the same URI. But remember that the route is not just the URI, it also includes the HTTP method. And in this case, because it's part of a link, links are always submitted with HTTP GET. So in this context, the link is what gives you the GET, right? The fact that it is a link and not a form submission gives you the GET. The URI is going to be the same no matter which one. So you'll end up getting the same result. And you can start to see a pattern developing, right? Where in general, routes that have an ID in them end up having a helper with a singular name, like the path for movie number 3 versus the path for all movies, or to add something to the movies collection in the case of posts. There was a question way in the back. Yes? If you wanted to get the movies index, would it be? Would you use like the plural? You could, yes, exactly. If you wanted to get the movies, so what's the route helper that gives you the very top one? It is movies underscore path, movies plural. So basically, you take the thing that's after as, and you add underscore path to it, always. Similar example. If you, in fact, you are submitting a form, so now we'll do one where the route involves something like post or put. Again, the first example is this is how you do it manually. We're creating a form that we would like to have submitted. I should have used an example other than put, but that's OK. The standard way that you construct a form, as you probably know if you were working on the homework recently, is that there's an action parameter that contains the URI to which the form should submit. So again, what does that mean for the route to which the form submits? It's the HTTP method plus the URI gives you the route. So here's a route that ideally would submit using put to /movies. And somewhere in the form is going to be, hopefully, a field that has the movie ID, right? Because this route, put /movies, expects that the route will have an ID in it somewhere. But we could have the same route using these helpers, right? We could say, sorry, that's the same typo as before. God, I'm a disaster with these today. I'm sorry about the singular and plural typos. God, hold on. Let me just change this to be actually a little friendlier. OK. Sorry, typos like this really get under my skin. I apologize. I've changed the example to be something a little more innocuous. So I've changed it to be just a regular post to /movies. Post to /movies is what maps to the create action. But we could also say movies path, which again, which one could this possibly match? Well, there's 1, 2 that would match movies path, and both of them end up having the same URI. So the same sort of pattern is at work here. And again, it's the same reasoning. The route will be generated in place based on what's in the routes file. So if the routes file changes, the stuff in your views does not have to change. And as we'll see, when we have resources that have relationships to each other, like the idea that a movie can have many reviews and the reviews sort of have to travel along with the movies, there are ways that you can construct RESTful routes that capture that fact. And the helper functions will make it easier to construct those too. So I know that this is usually the point where people who are first learning Rails say, why do you need all this machinery to do this relatively simple thing of establishing a standardized set of routes? The answer is because your app is going to get more complicated. And these helpers and the automatic mapping of routes to actions and the methods that generate them for you, when the app becomes just a little more complicated, it becomes much more obvious what this benefit is. So it's kind of, this is the stick with me part of this. And finally, as you'll see when you start stepping through the homework that is out now, which is you don't have to write any code, but it's sort of walking you through a Rails app in detail so you can actually see all of these pieces in action. One of the pieces you'll see is that in a Rails app, you typically won't even see an explicit form tag. Instead, you'll see the use of a Rails helper called the form tag that basically says, create me a form that submits to whatever movies path is with the post method. And post with movies path is going to be a create action. And then anything in the body of that form tag is going to be all the different form fields. So quite a bit of abstraction is happening here, right? It's trying to prevent you from having to do a lot of things by hand. Because if you generate these things automatically from the routes, you're probably less likely to make a mistake. Was there yes, a question?
What if there's the same HTTP verb and they have the same as?
So what happens if you have two routes where you have the same HTTP verb and you have the same as? That isn't necessarily a problem because the as is what determines, the as just determines when you call a helper what URI is going to be generated, right? So if, but I don't think it'll actually let you do that. I think it's an error to try to, basically you can't define routes in such a way that the mapping would be ambiguous. It's always the case that any particular helper method will uniquely determine the URI portion of the route. So I think what you're saying is if I had get/movies as movies, but I also had get/movie singular as movies plural, that would actually be an error. Because then when you said movies path, there would be no way for it to tell which one you actually meant. So it's actually an error to define them that way. Yes?
For that middle, the little gray box there, I might have missed this, but how does it know which movie to fill in for movie.name and movie.id?
Because my assumption, so the question is, in this example here, which movie is the one that is being used for movie.name and movie.id? I began the example by saying, by assumption, by the time the view is being rendered, we'll assume this variable has been set up somewhere. So the value of movie is being set up somewhere in code that you don't see, but we're just assuming for the sake of this example that it corresponds to some instance of a movie resource. And we can dereference its name and its ID. OK, we good here? More questions about this? This is a little bit hard to get your head around the first time you see it, but you get used to it really fast. Because it's a little hard to get your head around it, a few months ago, I wrote an app that helps you do that. I will show you what it is like. So in the top box, you can put anything that would legally go into routes.rb. So I'm going to, let's see, I can grab that one. And now I can check, could I resolve that route? Yes, I could. That route would map to the movies controller, a function or an action name called index, and this route doesn't have any params embedded in it. Or if I did, let's do this one. And now I say, what happens if I have a route like get/movies like 55? Same thing, except because this route actually does have a wildcard in it, it says that Rails would parse out ID as 55, and that would be available to you in the params hash. What if I instead said something like post/that? What's going to happen? Doesn't match any of the route patterns, because it doesn't, right? We haven't actually specified any routes that use post. So this app is free and open for everybody to use, and if you're curious how it works, the code is also open. But I want to show you one more cool thing about routes that the app also handles for you. And one of the things I said was, if you buy into a convention over configuration rule, like this one about how routes are named, usually the framework side of the bargain is you get something in return for that. What you get in return for this, for deciding that you're going to do your default RESTful routes according to this pattern of naming, is I could replace those 7 lines in the routes file with 1 line, which is that. I wanted to show you the basic manual version before showing you this, but if you say in your routes file just the 1 line resources movies, you are saying movies are a RESTful resource, and I want you to define the standard set of RESTful routes for create, read, update, delete, and index, and I want you to define the route helpers like movies path and all that other stuff that go with them, with that 1 line. And again, when we talk about apps where there are multiple resources that have relationships to each other, there are corresponding route helpers that will create much more sophisticated URIs for you. And just to prove that this works, I can go back to my little Heroku demo app, and I can replace all of this with resources movies, and I can say, what happens if I say put, like movies / something? Now it works, because one of the default RESTful routes is put with a route that has a ID wildcard in it is the one that maps to update, and Rails will pull out the ID parameter and give it back to us in the params hash. And we can say things like, what about a route like delete? Would that work? Will it? Heads are shaking. Why didn't it work? Because delete wants an argument, right? Like which one to delete. But if we said delete, that does what we expect. OK? So the app is here. Have fun with it. It's there for you to muck around with Rails routes until you sort of get the idea. So deep breath. Where are we? This file called routes.rb, which we've just seen the very basic things that it can do, but it can do hella more, is for defining not only basic RESTful routes, but you can also define other kinds of non-RESTful, non-standard routes in there too. Among the routes that are generated are for these other actions, new and edit, which are not technically part of the standard set of RESTful actions, but in a human-facing app, you need them because they're the way to give the human the opportunity to create the data that is going to be used in the create or update. We saw that you get these nice helper functions like movie path and movies path that give you the URI part of your route. You still need to specify the HTTP method of your route. If the route is appearing inside of a link, it's always get. If it's appearing as part of a form, it can be post or put or patch or delete. And when we talk about controllers in detail on Thursday, we'll see how Rails actually generates things like put, patch, and delete, even though web browsers only can do post for forms. And finally, always remember that it's the method and the URI that gives you the route. That's why it's OK for there to be a route called get/movies and another one called post/movies. And those are different routes. They do different things. They map to different actions. This is just sort of a way of having an economy so that you don't have a lot of different names for routes when the same one would do. Okay? So that is an overview of the basic RESTful routing support in Rails. Again, if it seems like killing ants with a pile driver for doing simple stuff, it sort of is, but you will come to appreciate it in due time. We haven't talked about controllers or views really at all, and that's because they're actually pretty similar to how they work in Sinatra. But I do want to talk about forms because this is something where some people get hung up a little bit sooner. And I'm going to once again go back to live coding mode and really hope it works. But here's what I'm going to do. We already talked about how in a human-facing app, creating or updating a resource is two interactions, because you first need to serve a representation of the resource, or in the case of creating, you need to serve like a blank template for creating it. And I apologize that this looks like it was designed with 70s wallpaper. That's before I learned the ways of Bootstrap, but it's an old picture. So for example, in the case of new or edit, you need one action that retrieves the form, which is either going to be blank in the case of new, or is going to have existing values in the case of edit. And then you need another action where the form gets submitted with the data, and that results in either creating or updating a record. So the question we address here is, how do you generate and display these forms? And how do you get the values filled in by the user and do something with them? I have here my simple application with one model, which is movie. You've seen that before. Here's my controller. There's not a whole lot going on in the controller, but we're going to focus on what happens when I try to do a new and create together. Right? So this is the workflow that would correspond to, as a user, I want to create a new movie. So I first need to get the form that I fill in. Then I submit that form, and that should result in the new movie actually being created. So how do those moving parts work? So I have a controller action for new. I have a controller action for create. Do I have routes for those actions? Where would I look to find the answer to that question? Routes.rb. And there's my one line, resources movies. That is the magic line that gives us all of the basic CRUD actions with the names like new, create, update, delete, etc. So I do have the routes. So the new action is going to have to essentially it's going to have to display a blank form, right? And the create action is going to somehow receive the contents of that form once it's filled out and hopefully use them to create the actual movie. So what does my view look like for that? Here's my blank form. So what are the elements of a form? First of all, where's the form going to go? Movie's path. What is that? Fortunately, I can say rake routes. And I can get a listing of all of the routes defined in my routes.rb. And here they are. So if I'm doing a form, and the default mechanism for form submission is post, and if it's posting to movies path, then I should be able to figure out which of these routes is going to be invoked for that form. Right? It's going to be a post, so that kind of narrows it down a lot. That routes to the movies create action, right? So that's the route that I'm going to get. And what's actually on the form? So you'll notice that I don't actually have any HTML tags here. I'm using form tag helpers, which are Rails' way of saying, hey, if you're creating a form that goes along with a particular kind of resource, I can deal with it. Because I can find out what the attributes of the resource are. You just tell me what kind of HTML element you want. So I'm going to have a label for the movie for the title. I'm going to have a text field where the title can be filled in. I'm going to have a select drop-down menu for the rating, and those are going to be the choices in the menu. Again, do not worry about trying to parse the syntax as you go. I'm giving you a tour. This is all explored in more detail in the homework. And finally, a submit tag that will have the label save changes. So what I want to do is actually run this app and see what this looks like when it's generated as a form in the browser. So I will start the app. I will fire up a Chrome window and make it a little smaller so we can actually see other stuff. And I'm going to go where to find my app? There's a hint, port 3000, localhost 3000. And why am I going to movies/new? Because in routes.rb, movies/new is what triggers the new action. So here's what the form looks like. And we should be able to basically map between this. Here's the HTML source. All right, I'll just skip past all the cruft. So when I said something like label movie title, Rails turned that into this nice HTML. When I said I want a text field for the movie's title, it turned it into this. Here is the thing I want you to notice about the way that Rails generates the actual HTML from my descriptions. And this is the reason that I'm using the form tag helpers instead of just hard coding HTML elements in there. Look at the weird name of this form field, movie bracket title. Why might it give a name like that? Well, I don't know. If we keep going down, here's another one. Here's my drop-down menu of ratings. Its name is movie bracket rating. Kind of a weird name for an HTML element. So let me display what happens. I'm going to fill out the form. I'm going to submit the form to the create action, but I'm going to put a breakpoint in the controller so that as soon as we hit the controller action, we can stop the show and actually examine what got returned. Here's my form. I'm going to create a movie, even though I chose the worst possible one. Sure, whatever, save changes. Now before I hit save, and this is a technique that will be very valuable to you, I'm going to go back to my controller. I think we can agree that when I submit the form, if everything goes as planned, I'm going to end up in this create action, right? So I'm going to stick bybug in there, and I'm going to stop the show. All right, so here we go. Here's my app running. I'm going to save changes. And there we are. OK? Look how cool this is. I am stopped at this point in the code. So I can actually inspect the values of all the things that I'm about to munge with. In particular, OK, params, it's a little bit hard to read, but bear with me because I want to show you something. Look what happened here. I have an entire hash where the title is a key, the rating is a key, the release date in these weird month, day, year menus is a key. In fact, I can even say this So why is this important? I'm going to use my final 3 minutes to explain it. Okay? Remember when I said, look at these weird names like movie bracket title, movie bracket rating, movie bracket release date, all this stuff. Rails generated those names for us. It generated them so that when params are actually parsed out, everything on the form comes out as a single hash. The keys of that hash are the attributes of a movie. The value for each key is the thing that the user filled in on the form. Why is that a really, really useful representation? Because when you call new or create, what do you pass? You pass a hash of attributes and values. So basically, when I use those form tag helpers, the params I receive are essentially ready to be passed directly to create or directly to update attributes. I don't have to do any additional work. I do not have to manually construct a hash of things to pass because the names of the forms on the web page have been constructed in such a way that params has that hash automatically. So if I now step to the next line, let's make the window narrower again. It created the movie. There was no error, or I would have seen an exception. And in fact, if I print the movie now, I can see that it has acquired an ID. So this really worked. And the last thing I'm going to do is, do I render a view? Well, if I just created something, it's not clear what view it makes sense to render. But it would be reasonable to go back to the listing of all movies, and then the user could see that the movie they just created is actually there, which is why the last thing in my controller action is just a redirect back to the index. And if I let the program run, and I go back to my web browser, there it is at the end, and it has all worked. Again, there were a lot of details in here, and the point was not to absorb all the details. It is to see the tour and understand what Rails is trying to do. In the common case, the form is there for you to make some changes to a resource. Therefore, Rails will generate that form in such a way that the names of the form elements arrive in the params hash ready to be used with all of the active record calls. There'll be active record practice exercises. Homework 4 has a lot more detail on this. I realize it is a lot to absorb, but you're all doing really well, so stick with me and have a great weekend. Try to stay dry.